And how's it going? And welcome to No Fun Allowed. Today you are joined by a very special guest, Dennis from Let's Read TSR.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for showing up because I got recommended to your site a little bit ago, and it was fascinating to me. And I said, hey, I wanted to get to seeing what's going on with this. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Um, so, uh, as a kid growing up in the 90s, I read quite a few of the TSR novels. They were just sort of uh, popcorn sort of things you could devour one after another. Um, and years later, I am coming back to them as an adult and seeing how they still hold up today, where where time has not been kind to them, and just examining them as interesting sort of pop cultural objects.
Yeah, absolutely. I unfortunately I didn't get to be into the whole D&D thing until much later in my life, but looking back on it, there's some obviously some hidden gems and there's obviously some hidden duds. So we're going to be talking about all of those today. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and talk about is when did you first start reading these books in life, and what was the first one you read? How'd you get into it, and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, good place to start. Um, I think the first one I read would have been around 1989 or 1990. That was uh, kind of an odd starting point. Darkness and Light, which is one of the Dragonlance Preludes novels, and it's a bonkers novel. It's uh, two characters from the Dragonlance books meet a bunch of weird gnomes, get in a spaceship, fly to the moon, meet a space dragon. Like it's yeah. But it was fun, and I ended up picking up a bunch more, and a couple of my friends did too. And pretty soon we were just sort of sharing them around in a collective library.
So did like picking up those books, like did that influence the D&D at the time, or did that influence all the other storytelling and things you were seeing? What was the cultural impact on that for you?
It definitely affected the way we played D&D. Yeah, maybe moving it a bit less from pure hack and slash stuff to trying to tell stories, even though we were terrible at it at the time.
The
And
attempt is the A for effort, right?
yeah, yeah, um, it's a very particular skill that as a teenager you don't really know how to do. There's a lot of scope for cool stuff there, but you don't really understand how until you see someone who's really good at it do it, I think.
And back then, there was no live streams, there was no Critical Role, there was no whatever, right? That was just you showed up to whoever's basement and played D&D, and that was that.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people forget that Dragonlance has such a huge impact on the actual way we play D&D. At one point, D&D was I go to one room, kill the monster, go to the next room, kill the monster. Dragonlance really pushed forward the idea of a narrative of characters that actually, survived longer than a session. So, and, characters that you would actually bother naming, right?
Mhm.
So, looking back on all of this, you read these books in the past and now you step up and read them in the future. How thick were those nostalgia glasses? I need to know.
Uh, not as thick as I was afraid they'd be.
Okay.
Um, I I knew going in that a lot of them wouldn't hold up. Like just I know that back then as a young teenager, I did not have any taste really. I was just a black hole that would suck in any media, uh, regardless of quality. And it's not a bad approach. You end up reading a bunch of good stuff and a bunch of bad stuff, but I was pretty sure that when I came back to this, that a lot of this was going to be much worse than I remembered.
I mean, that's good to hear because there's a lot of things that we do and read in our childhood, and we look back on it, and then we're like, oh man, actually, that was not great or whatever. But it is good to hear that some things are holding up.
Well, you have to be realistic about it, I guess. And I was surprised at um, it, it's a pleasant surprise every time I find one that does hold up really well.
That's good. So kicking things off here, why D&D books? At the time there was all these fantasy things coming out. D&D was just a thing that was attached to a game. So was that the entire reason?
Well, the reason why I read them, or the reason why I started reviewing them later.
Both, I guess.
Fair enough. The reason why I started reading them is probably similar to the reason why most people started reading them. I mean, there was a fair amount of crossover between D&D players and people who read the TSR novels, but there were also a number of people who just read the TSR novels without playing D&D, and a lot of it is because they were easily accessible pop culture, right? It was I've described it before as the literary equivalent of a McDonald's hamburger. They're present in any bookstore you walk into anywhere in North America and often elsewhere in the world. And if you pick one up, you know exactly what you're going to get. It's not going to be fantastic, probably, but it's going to be what you're looking for.
Absolutely. Because there's always at any given point in time for the past 50 years, there's always been trashy, fantasy or sci-fi novels and all that.
Mhm.
But of course, TSR had the privilege of pumping out a pretty decent volume, and they did so quite well in that regard. So, did the setting in particular draw you in, or just the name right there, the TSR, the Dragonlance, the
Um, Good question. The I don't think it was so much about the setting necessarily. It was just sort of a comfort food stories, that you're going to have a story where, apart from the Ravenloft books, you know, there are challenges and good beats evil and things are okay.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah, and you in particular, you stepped in at a very odd time because you joined in on one that was both fantasy and sci-fi, which not all of the TSR books did.
yeah, it was more kind of steampunk than sci-fi, as I recall. I haven't gotten around to reviewing that yet,
Okay.
but so it'll be interesting to reread that
Yeah, I mean, steampunk
30
makes
years
sense.
later.
Gnomes going to the moon, I guess. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
So those
I'm
those
sorry.
those books absolutely live in a lot of people's hearts and minds, and that genre in particular, it's somehow held up to this day. As I just mentioned, you can go to your bookstore right now, or maybe not, depending on what time you're watching this video. But you go to the bookstore and the fantasy section is just filled with books you've never seen or heard of. But they're all different types of fantasy and high, low, the steampunk, sci-fi, whatever the case may be. And the genre is still kicking to this day. But I
Yeah.
would like to think that over the course of time, everyone is learning from the past, and something you're doing is shedding a light on that past, and that is very good because there's some things that need to be shed a light on. There's some things that need to be avoided, and some things that need to be maybe not repeated but expanded upon. So, what motivated you to start this epic journey of taking that whole TSR bookshelf and reading it one by one?
Well, um, I think it was something you touched on earlier, actually, that society tends to make a really sharp distinction between highbrow culture and lowbrow culture, where, people will write reams and reams of words about, something like Citizen Kane, but will turn up their noses at, say, an Adam Sandler movie. And fair enough, an Adam Sandler movie won't be good. But to say that only things that are highbrow are worthy of being examined is kind of missing the point. because when you, I think it was William Burroughs who said, whatever you put into the machine, it will process. He was thinking more along the lines of subliminal messaging, but uh, it's kind of applicable here that when you have just a constant stream of stuff going into your brain, it all affects who you are and who you become. And only a small percentage of that is going to be art. The rest of it is going to be anything from, you know, billboards and bus advertisements and banner ads and television sitcoms, stuff you hear on the radio. I think a lot of what shapes us is the, you know, quote unquote lowbrow culture. And for me, growing up reading these books was a big part of my childhood. So I thought it would be interesting to go back and look and try to see how the culture I consumed back then shaped me.
Okay. Did anyone actually influence you in this decision, or did you just sit down and realize, you know what, I need to hammer this out. I want to do it. Or did you know someone else say, hey, you should do that. That sounds awesome.
Um, I think I actually got the idea from reading a book. There was a collection of film criticism by uh, a fellow named James Agee, who, I mean, he's mostly known for being a Pulitzer Prize fiction writer, but it wasn't until, you know, just fairly recently that I discovered he was also uh, a screenplay writer and a really good film critic for many years. And I'm just reading through a collection of his stuff, seeing how he could talk about schlock and the fanciest European films with the same degree of concentration, and how he had something interesting and insightful to say about just about everything was it really made me think differently about the concept of criticism. That you're sort of taught growing up that, you know, those who can do, those who can't criticize, uh, and that, you know, criticism is a sort of a parasite hanging on art. Um, but it sort of made me realize that good criticism can tell you as much or more than the thing it's criticizing.
Okay. Yeah, because yeah, we'll be getting into all that, but you have this big old table on, you know, how you rank stuff and all that. But something I wanted to ask you is, when you sat down and fully realized, you know what, I'm gonna read that bookshelf. Did you actually look at the bookshelf? Did you consider how long it was actually going to take?
I did. I
Okay.
did. I I mean, I did have some scope where, you know, it's just the books from this one publisher and just the stuff from the classic TSR period from about 87 to I think 1997. But even still, that is at least a few hundred books.
Oh yes.
And I knew it would be a hell of a project, and I wasn't even sure I would get this far. But unfortunately, I'm a fairly fast reader. You know, I can blow through one of these in a few hours, but I found that that didn't actually help me nearly as much as I was hoping it would, because I find that when I'm reading a book in order to review it, I have to be reading it very differently than when I'm just reading for pure enjoyment.
Yeah, I
I'm
was about to say there has to be something to it, right? Because your process of reading these books, it's not just reading the book and then reviewing it right after. You undoubtedly are sitting there analyzing something. You may reread, you know, some line just to make sure. And you may, of course, be jotting down some notes for future use. You know, that is a tremendous ordeal. And like you said, if you're really reading a sequel or a trilogy or whatever, you have to go back and probably analyze things to once again. You know, that's a big endeavor, of course. So Man, I just between the 10 years of TSR putting out these books, do you know how many authors there were? I could not find, unfortunately.
Dozens.
Dozens. Okay.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, I don't have that figure on hand either, but it kind of follows a power law where you've got a handful of really popular authors like R.A. Salvatore and uh, Ed Greenwood and whatnot, who were prolific and wrote a whole bunch of books.
Oh yes.
Um, like R.A. Salvatore alone did over 50. Yeah,
Just in that time?
not just in that time actually.
Okay.
I think
Okay.
50 is his total Forgotten Realms output.
I was about to say because I know he's been putting out some Drist quite recently,
Yep.
but golly, that's I'd like in my mind I'm looking at this bookshelf, but I just can't imagine like staring up at this titan that you're tackling here. So
Well,
speaking of, you obviously read some of these books when you were a kid, or at least younger. Did you actually have all those books on hand, or are you having to actually slowly accumulate all these books over time?
well, the trick is to not look at the entire bookshelf,
That's the
right?
trick.
With any huge task, the trick is to just look at the next thing to do and keep doing the next thing until you look back and go, wow, that was a bunch of things. Uh, so yeah, I don't have them all. Oh, good Lord. That would be a lot of space that I don't have. So I sometimes I can find used physical copies. Sometimes if I have a hard time doing that, I will often pick up, scanned or OCR versions online, which is not ideal, but keeps the momentum going.
Absolutely. I imagine some of those would be next to impossible to track down because they've been just lost to time and space, right? I imagine that, and in fact, I imagine some of those books probably want to be lost and forgotten, but you're about to excavate all these things for whatever they're worth, right?
There are some that would be better off in landfills.
Unfortunately, that we'll be getting to that one in a moment. But there are certain tropes and ideals that were present during the time which do not fit in today's land and scope and all that fun jazz. So, when you sat down and you finally cracked open this first book, did you
Mhm.
have an idea in regards of, you know what, I'm going to read one book a week? Or did you have that quota already in mind? Or did you sit there and realize there's no way I can have any sort of actual real quota?
It's a good question. I think I decided early on that I wasn't going to try and force myself to any particular schedule because the only way to keep doing a project like this consistently over years, and I guess I'm coming up on 3 years next month, is to keep it fun. And if you feel like you have, deadlines and a schedule, then it starts to feel like work. So but I kind of roughly aim for a every new review up every 2 to 4 weeks schedule because it's a couple of reasons. One, I find that the longer I spend reading a book, the better the resulting review usually is. That if I just sit down and blow through a book in a few hours and then try to write a review of it, um, stuff hasn't had enough time to sort of percolate around in my brain for the interesting thoughts to get out. But what I'll often do is just read a book a little bit at a time, you know, uh, 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there, just taking notes as I go and just let it sort of sit on the back burner. And uh, usually I can find enough interesting things to write about a book. There are some books where it's a struggle, but most of them I've had uh, something interesting to say, often something that I didn't know I was about to say before I started writing the review.
Okay.
I do worry that at some point they will get similar and repetitive enough that I will run out of things to say,
Mm.
and I'll just be, cutting and pasting bits from earlier reviews. But
I
hasn't
think you can blame the book on that one instead of your review style.
They did have a period from like 95 to 97 where they were in financial difficulty at TSR, and they figured the solution was to just crank out as many books as possible. And that did not do them any favors for the the quality of the writing.
No, not
So
at all.
I'm into that period for the Forgotten Realms books right now, and it's getting rough.
Absolutely.
But
So it is no secret that you are an avid reader. You know, it sounds like you've been reading your whole life and you're continuing to do reading. So you are reading all these books and you're reading them in anywhere between a 2 to 4 month week period. So, what are you reading anything else on the side? Are you to recharge the old noggin? Because I'm sure reading this would fry your brain if you just read it straight.
oh
What's
yeah,
the do you have a quota with that too? Do you read one TSR book and then one other non TSR book? Do you have any sort of plan with that?
yeah, it is important to break it up and read other things as palate cleansers in between, because I think at a certain point you just if you have a few bad books in a row, your eyes glaze over and you just sort of get uh, inured to the bad things. Whereas if you break it up with, these TSR fantasy novels plus novels by other authors or completely different books, nonfiction, whatever, um, you come back to it with a, I won't say a more objective point of view because I don't think you really can review something objectively, but um, a better calibrated point of view.
Okay.
So, yeah, I read an awful lot of other stuff, uh, you know, not just fantasy and sci-fi, but lots of non-genre fiction, lots of nonfiction, uh, lots of history. Yeah, it's it's good to be omnivorous. I think you get a sort of slanted perspective if you only,
Oh, undoubtedly,
yeah.
undoubtedly.
It would be like, if all I read was fantasy novels, it'd be like if all I ate was hamburgers. I like hamburgers, but I can't do them every day.
There's only so much mayo and mustard and veggies you can put on it before it's still just a burger, right?
Yep.
And I've been in that scenario. I remember I was on a binge where I read nothing but sci-fi novels, and then I woke up one day and I was like, "Oh my lord, I need to consume something else. I need to because there's only so much I can consume of one little thing here." And that's a tough ordeal to find because sometimes you find yourself liking something and then you get blindsided to everything else. So one thing I want to talk about is your readings and all this. We touched upon a little on this, but do you actually have a thorough note-taking process during the whole reading of a book, or is it just scribbles in the margins? Is it like a full-blown document? What's the idea behind that?
Yeah. Well, uh, I am very much the sort of person who winces at the thought of scribbling in the margin of a book. Who flinches every time I see someone open a book too wide and break the spine or something.
That's
So
the worst.
yeah, um, I I do take a lot of notes, and uh, if I have a paper copy, I can use a paper notebook next to it. If I'm reading it on my phone, I'll just use the notes app on my phone to keep track of it, and then just email myself the notes afterwards. And by the end of the book, I've usually got a pretty sizable just pile of random thoughts. I don't try to put them in any sort of order or organize them or polish them. And it can be a pretty substantial amount of random thoughts. Not all of that goes into the finished review. I'll just take the notes and just sort of go over them one by one, see if there's a place I can slot them into the the rough outline for the review that's forming in my head, and then just keep doing that until the entire structure of the review is done, and then any details that don't end up getting used, well, probably weren't that interesting in the first place.
Fair enough. So you started off this journey oh so long ago now, 3 years ago. Has that process evolved over time, or has it, not needed any reform?
Mm, it's gotten a little refined over time, but it hasn't substantially changed, I think.
Okay.
There are some reviews where I need to do some extra work, um, like my review of The Ring of Winter, for instance, ended up turning into kind of a long digression about the Lost World genre of fantasy, where I ended up going off and reading a couple other books for comparison, and then coming back and writing the review. But those are fairly rare. Most of them are self-contained, and um, I've already got the points of comparison in my head, and the research involved is occasional. Think about it, turn notes into review.
Okay. Yeah. So, the whole Ring of Winter thing. I'm a huge Tomb of Annihilation nerd. I've ran that module many, many times now, and so incorporating Artist Cimber and Ring of Winter and yada yada, this and that, it's a big deal. Rime of the Frost Maiden just came out with O'Real, so that's a big old thing too. And I think it is important to, if you are a dedicated full time DM, that it can be very thought provoking and knowledgeable to go ahead and read some of those old books so you can incorporate the world into your games. I think that's certainly worthwhile doing.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. Like it is very useful as a DM to have more uh, material to draw on. But the flip side of that is that sometimes you see people who insist that this is the history of the setting, and if you're not following it, you're not playing D&D right.
And
And
there's definitely those people.
I have absolutely no patience for that. That if somebody just wants to run a module that refers to some Forgotten Realms history or previous characters, and they don't strictly follow the Stations of the Cross in dealing with it, cool, they're being creative, they're having fun. So it's I agree that it is good that there's all of this history and background material to draw on, but um, you have to treat it as a fun, useful reference and not as a straitjacket.
Absolutely. I always spout this to the heavens, but anyone could run any module, anybody could run any whatever, but only you can run your own game. And that's what the people at your table want to do. They want to play your game. And
Exactly.
looking at that map right there, behind you, you can't see it, of course, but that map behind you is, that shares so many epic tales between so many years of D&D, and there's a ton of books that take place all over there. There's a ton of modules that take place all over that map. But I'm willing to bet that the best stories that ever came out of anything were someone just coming up with some stuff on the top of their head, not written in some book somewhere.
Yep, absolutely.
So speaking of, how is reading all these books influenced your D&D? I'm curious.
Well, it definitely gives you a lot of ideas to play with. Um, I have run a number of games. My present game is currently on hiatus while another one of our players is running a game, but we'll get back to that. And there are lots of ideas in these books, even when they're bad. Like a lot of the time, you see a book that had a lot of potential, that had some good thoughts behind it, and the implementation was just a train wreck. Or maybe in the hands of another author, that story could have been told a lot better. So when I see those, I file them away. Um, I've got a just sort of a text document of random ideas that I've gotten from books that I can file the serial numbers off of and just slot into a game.
Is there any, like, let's, for broad term here, do you take any quest from any of these books, give it to your players, and then see how it pans out versus the book?
I haven't been haven't been quite that literal so far.
Okay.
I tend to treat the ideas from things that I read as more of jumping off points that I still need to do some work to put my own spin on it than something I can drop in fully formed. But it's a good source of inspiration. But I kind of suspect that my players would notice if I started just picking something else up wholesale and putting it in without changing anything or filing any of the serial numbers off, because I think if you play with someone for long enough, you figure out what their unique voice is, and you can hear when things aren't in that voice. And I think that's true of pretty much any form of storytelling, not just D&D.
Absolutely. So you don't take any of the quests and do them literally, but do you take any named characters and drop them into your world?
I haven't done that.
Okay.
I've tried to treat them as archetypes, where you can boil characters, uh, you can boil them down into the basics, and then put some new flesh on the bones. Like you can take a like, okay, just to use an example that'll be familiar to a lot of readers, though not something I've done. Drizzt, for instance. Like if you just drop him straight into a game, your players will just go, "Oh, God, seriously?" But there are things about that character that you can use to build an interesting character. Someone who's an outcast for some reason. What reason? Maybe a different reason. Maybe not race. Um, yeah, uh, someone who is, very good at their job, but unappreciated by society for the good stuff they do. And then you take that sort of theme and make a new character based on that. And you can still use the original character. I think, oh man, in this situation, what would this book character do? And then use that to inform the character's decisions. But if you don't use uh, if you don't follow the existing material slavishly, you will have something that feels new and interesting to your characters. Like even if they know the original material you're stealing from, it's become different enough that it still hits all the same high notes that they liked that material for, but doesn't feel like plagiarism.
Thankfully, I DM for a bunch of Neanderthals who never pick up books, so I'm at liberty to do whatever the heck I want. But I wholeheartedly agree that straight up copying, it's not as creative, and I honestly don't think it's as fun for both the players and the DMs. I think taking influences and meshing them with your own ideals can certainly be a blast. And not only that, but you're not as constricted in certain regards. Like if you bring Drizzt into your campaign, then instead of thinking, oh, what would Drizzt might do, you have to think to yourself, what would Drizzt do? And gotta play to a certain sort of theme.
And again, then you start to get constrained by canon.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you use a person or a place or an organization or something in a way that doesn't fit with their depiction in source books or novels, then players who have read those source books or novels, like even if they don't complain about it, they will still feel a dissonance between the story in their head and the story you're telling.
And then, of course, you can have the cop out of, oh, those are just stories; they're not real. You can be boring like that, but
Yeah. Ultimately, I think you learn a lot more by trying to make things your own.
Yeah, I mean that's what D&D was about, right? D&D, like, when it first came out, there was no such thing as a module. You just picked up the rules and you just made your own dungeon, and that's what Gygax told every DM to do: make your own dungeon. And that I think that there's some merit to what was said oh so long ago, and just keep on doing what you want to do. And speaking of that, I guess dropping back into books here, you're going in here and reading all these or making all these reviews, but do you actually read any reviews of any of the books that you're reading to get sort of a basis or a guide or anything of that nature?
No, no,
No.
I deliberately try not to.
Okay.
No, for a couple of reasons. One is that if you're reading reviews of this book beforehand, it will bias you. Like I'm not going to say again that it will make you less objective a reviewer, because there's no such thing. Every review comes from your own experiences, your own opinions, your own thoughts, and no two people are going to have the same experience of a book. But if you read somebody else's review first, you absorb some of their experiences and start regurgitating those instead of your own. So I try to know as little about the book as I can when I go in. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of research about, details about the setting or the author or something. But when I'm reading the book, I want to be experiencing it for the first time as much as possible. And afterwards, once the review's already written, I haven't really bothered seeking out other people's reviews, largely because people disagree with each other all the time on reviews, and that's okay. That there's kind of a temptation to have your ideas validated by reading someone else who agrees with you. But the more I work on this, the more I realize that doesn't matter. That someone who reads a book that I didn't like and loved it, great, good for them. And like, they had a different experience reading it than I did, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong. And you can't really determine an objective quality to a book by just averaging out everyone's reviews. Because if you're doing that, then you are reviewing for a hypothetical average reader that doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Everyone has their own mindset that they bring to the table when they read a book. Different people will get different things out of different books. I think the best you can do is find a particular reviewer who has a very similar approach to you and trust them, rather than doing some sort of Rotten Tomatoes style, what did everybody think in aggregate approach.
Well, spoiler alert: no one's doing what you're doing. You're one of a kind in this regard.
I guess I'm thinking more about criticism in general than the specific niche.
Absolutely.
But
But I mean, obviously there's reviews of every book ever, but no one person has done a review of all these books that you're doing. So
yeah,
you are a pioneer in that regard.
well, there are still reviews to be found. There's still
Yeah.
places like Goodreads.com and whatnot where people post reviews of things they've read, and pretty much every book has been reviewed somewhere by someone. Just not necessarily all of these books by the same person.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that you're the only person that's doing this. But I mean, hey, that means you get to be a first. In a world of 7 billion people, you can say that I'm the only one that's done this. I think that's pretty cool.
It is a strange landmark of sorts.
You planted that flag on that mountain. So you don't seek out any other reviews, which is interesting because you have your own grading system.
Mhm.
So yeah, we're gonna start diving into this grading system here. Where did it come from? What influenced it, and how has it been implemented? Has there been revisions over time? We're going to be diving into all that. So let's go ahead and start from the beginning. How did your grading system come to life?
Hmm. Well, the grading system I'm using is just a basic A to F sort of scale. But the tricky part is calibrating what does A mean and what does F mean,
Yes,
because
because for my Europeaner listeners here, we in the U.S. use a different grading system than what you all use.
yeah,
Very arbitrary, I know.
yeah. So A being the best, F being the worst, and I've always wondered why there's no E. Oh, well, something for another time. So I think, yeah, the hard part was calibrating where the top and bottom of the scale are, because, like I said, I went into this expecting that a lot of them would be much worse than I remembered. So uh, the top of the scale I figured would be a good book, like not an outstanding book that changed the way I think or anything. Nothing that's going to win a Hugo Award. Just something that was entertaining, enjoyable, tightly crafted, and that I wouldn't feel any hesitation about recommending to someone to read. And going down from there, there's a B would be nearly there, but some distracting flaws that would keep me from recommending it wholeheartedly. C, sort of your run of the mill fantasy novel, the sort of thing that springs to mind when you think of your uh, extruded fantasy product of the 1990s. And below that is the morass of things that make me wonder what I'm doing with my life.
So,
There's a
yeah, before we stray too far, have you actually noticed any correlation between a length of a novel or the time it was and the grade that you're giving it? Is there any sort of discernible pattern where not with any preconceived notion, but you pick up a book and think to yourself, I already know it's going to be a this, or that?
um, length is not really a factor because all of these were mass market paperbacks, 320 pages. So uh, I think a the important factor for quality here is, did they feel like they had to really struggle to fill 320 pages? Because there are some books where you're reading and you're thinking, this is filler, but this doesn't even have to be here. It is contributing nothing to the characters or the plot or the setting. Like, the author is clearly just scrambling to fill pages so that they can make the deadline. Whereas other books, you finish them and you think, man, I wish they had another 200 pages to work with, because some of that stuff got really crammed in there.
And that's unfortunate because, like you said, 300 being locked to 320 pages, some people are going to be stretching it and some people are going to be, squeezed in between, and some people are going to have to, shave off just enough edges. I can't imagine telling any author ever you have to be exactly this number of pages. I couldn't imagine telling anyone that, like the story that you're trying to tell shouldn't be construed to some arbitrary number in the corner.
Well, yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, it's definitely true that some stories have a natural length, and trying to fit them into this Procrustean bed of 320 pages is sometimes cruel. But on the other hand, constraints are very important in art. That um, if you put all of the world's terrible poetry together in one place, I think the vast majority would be free verse, where, where people have no rules or constraints, no rhyme, no meter, no limits to how they can write it. And so they just do whatever and do a terrible job. Whereas having constraints, like if you're writing a sonnet, you've got to follow this rhyme pattern with this stress on each line. And it makes you think really hard about each line. And uh, you end up being challenged by these constraints and usually learning something from it.
Yeah, I think a perfect example I always hear and see come up is if the cathedral was any bigger, would Michelangelo have painted 1,000 angels on the side with God and Adam touching each other in the middle, right? All that other side stuff. If this cathedral is a mile long, at what point does it actually matter?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it is always good to have a little frame to work with for sure. It keeps people from doing too much, I guess. So you don't only grade on an A to F scale with no E because America. You also have a Bechdel test.
Yep.
So can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about that?
Right. Well, the Bechdel test is just a simple metric for uh, how gender is treated in a novel, where the rule is it passes the test if there are two female characters, they have names, they talk to each other about something that isn't a man. And you'd think that would be easy.
Oh no! Oh no!
You'd think it wouldn't be that hard.
Oh, it shouldn't be, but as we all know, sadly, our little hobby has sadly been it started somewhat in sexist roots. The common thing that we all know is AD and our original D&D. Women were just straight up worse than men, and there's all that
Yeah.
whole little thing there.
So
But
I think you've really hit on why I wanted to keep track of that is just like it was the late 80s, early to mid 90s, and that was not a good time for representation in fantasy for anyone who was not a white dude.
oh, absolutely.
So I thought it'd be interesting to just see, which authors were consistently good at that, which were consistently terrible, and how closely it correlated to overall grade.
Yes, I'm sure I'm gonna have it like flashing up here a little snippet of your grading system and all the things you've graded so far. So have you actually found a correlation between the A's are always consistent with these authors and always succeeding the Bechdel test, and these authors are always failing and da da da? Is there any sort of metric that you have so far, or is it just left, right, and center?
The correlation is there but weak. It's not quite as black and white as I suspected it might be.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't done any statistics on it, but that's just sort of my gut feeling from looking over the list of all of the novels and their grades.
Yeah, so I mean, 56 is not 56. Why did I say 56? Yeah, no, 56 books in total. That is not actually a true representation. You would not be able to take that to the scientific board and have a true analysis because that's too small of a sample size. But I think pretty much the best sample size that anybody's got so far. So I think we could reasonably work with that.
Yep.
Um, is so you start right from the get-go doing this. Is there anything over the course of time that you wish you had changed or reformed or added to, taken away over the time, or are you perfectly happy with the grading system that you have now?
Um, I'm pretty happy with it. There's only been one novel so far that I haven't that I felt didn't fit into the grading system very well.
Meh.
Well, no, it was well on the index the grade is just listed as no
No, yeah.
because I could not finish it.
Just
I,
couldn't.
I have an iron stomach for bad books, but this one defeated even me. It just I got to a
That
point.
book was corrosive.
It was Once Around the Realms by Brian Thompson, and I got to a point midway through where I realized that there was just no point in continuing. That there was I had everything I needed to say about this novel. I could explain why I got to this point and stopped in excruciating detail and in a way that I hope was entertaining for the readers. But I, the review would not be any more insightful or interesting if I kept going and kept finding new things to groan at.
So you hope the review is more interesting than the book itself.
Exactly. Yeah, it was the worst professionally published novel I've ever read.
Wow, and that's not just including TSR.
No,
Wow,
yeah,
that's
but but
that's
in
impressive.
general, things fall pretty well into the categories I set up at the beginning. That nothing's been higher than a good solid book, and nothing has been lower than, with that one exception, I read this and I wish I could get that time back, which is my criteria for F.
TSR, you owe me time. So you are going. You're chugging along right now, as we just mentioned. 56. Oh my goodness.
I am working on the 57th at the moment. Yeah.
57th. Golly. So, yeah, where is your headspace now versus where you started? I imagine a young and bright and cheery Dennis going, "Da, da, da, I'm going to start off this whole collection." And then I just see now this grizzled veteran who's being worn down by this slog of books. Is that where you are, or are you standing tall?
Uh, I'm still feeling pretty good.
Okay.
Uh, I've got a few regular commenters who will read and start discussions on each post, so it's always fun to put things up and see what they say. And I haven't yet gotten to the point where I feel like reviews are repeating themselves. Thus far, I've always been able to find something different to say about each book, which I expect, given that we're talking about a few hundred books at least. Long before I get to the end, I will hit the point where there's nothing new to say. But it hasn't happened yet, and I'm happy to just keep trucking along until I plow into that brick wall.
Yeah, and I imagine that the lack of fatigue could possibly be, as we mentioned earlier, the fact that there were so many different authors, and even though they're covering the same land and the same scape, thankfully these authors are at least trying to put their own unique spin, but some of them may not succeed, of course.
Well, that's just it, right? Like there are a lot of bad books here. Some good ones, some okay ones, but a fair number of bad ones. But when they're bad, they are bad in interesting ways often. Ways that I can think about and then write about. And I guess my criteria for a good review, and it's not necessarily one that I always hit, but one that I strive for, is that you come away from it having learned something. And I think this is true of criticism in general, that any good piece of criticism, maybe after reading it, you've learned something about the culture or the environment that produced that book. Maybe you've learned something about the craft of the medium. Maybe you've even just learned a new word you didn't know before. But um, someone should get something out of it. And I think a fair number of my reviews hit that mark. Some don't, but it's a good thing to strive for.
Absolutely. When we're coming into any sort of medium of art, we either want it to be really great or so bad that it's at least worth laughing at. And it sounded like the Around the World in 80 Days. Oh, my apologies, the Around Forgotten Realms in 80 Days
Yeah.
book. That sounded like it was directly in the center of being so mundane and so worthless that it didn't strike any fancy, right?
Well, the main problem with that was the constant breaking of the fourth wall.
Mm.
Like there was no part in the first half of that book where it felt like the author knew what they were doing or gave a quarter of a shit. So the ones that I've rated, D and F so far, have been cases where someone has sincerely tried to write a fantasy novel and just bombed, but they tried.
Yeah,
So
that's
I can respect that, even if I didn't enjoy reading it. And it's tricky sometimes because when you're criticizing something, there is um, that instinct to just do a hit piece on something bad, right? That you just you want to write something that makes fun of it. You want to write something that just tears the author a new one. But that is mildly entertaining, but ultimately kind of mean spirited, and again, you don't learn from it. The reader doesn't come away uh, feeling like they've taken anything interesting away from your review aside from that thing sucked, and that's not an interesting thing to say. So there are some authors that I've had a harder time with this than others. Douglas Niles is one. Man, I started dreading his books after a while. But you have to struggle to not just slag on it and find the interesting things to say about not just that it is bad, but how it's bad and why it's bad and what they could have changed to make it better.
because, yeah, I'm sure over the course of reading hundreds of books, if you have got enough trashy ones, then there's only so many ways you can say this sucks, right? There's only so many
Exactly.
ways you can say this author does this and that. And so you just mentioned this. You begin dreading. You pick up that book, and then you see the author and go, ugh. So, how often does that take place? Do you sit there and pick up a book and see the author and then think to yourself, oh man, this is going to be great or this is going to be terrible? Or do you pick up a series and think to yourself, okay, because I know it's a trilogy, then the first one's going to be meh, but the second one might pick up? Or, do you have these preconceived notions when you're picking up these books?
Oh yeah, I mean it's impossible not to bring your experiences with previous books to the table when you're reading a new one. If I've read a bunch of books that I didn't like by another author, I don't have high hopes that the next one I pick up is going to suddenly be amazing. Uh, I try not to let that prejudice me too much, but it's also an interesting thing to talk about sometimes to show how a particular author fails in the same way repeatedly. Like if they have a particular mindset that leads them to tell the same story over and over again, or have the same weird attitudes over and over again. You can point that out and talk about it. So even if I don't necessarily like the books, I can usually find interesting things to say.
That's
And
good.
there are some authors that I look forward to as a nice break, where I know that they're going to be, good or great. Like,
And mind you, fair viewers, you don't sit there and say, okay, I'm going to read all these authors and then I'm going to read these. You're going by pure chronological order, correct?
mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, you arbitrarily chose not to choose how you read these novels, which is curious. Actually, I want a little look on this. Was there any coordination at all between any of the authors when writing these books, or were they so completely separate entities that it didn't matter?
They were mostly separate entities that it didn't matter. I mean,
Okay.
keep in mind this was being written back before the internet was a household thing,
Mm-hmm.
where coordination between authors was either some of them lived and worked at TSR in Lake Geneva, where they could talk to each other face to face. Otherwise, it was posting manuscripts to each other with FedEx and long phone calls. So the degree of collaboration they could do was a bit more limited, and uh, they rarely needed to. Like I've started off with reviewing the Forgotten Realms novels, and like the way that TSR treated the Forgotten Realms was largely as a sandbox, right? Where it's this huge world, and an author can take one little corner of it somewhere and set a story there with a handful of characters they've made up, and it won't interfere with the stuff that's going on over here. So the authors didn't have to worry about stepping on each other's toes as much as they did with, say, Dragonlance, where you had these big, sweeping, epic, world-changing things going on. And there were some examples where they did collaborate, like the Avatar trilogy, where they were doing some books to explain the changeover between the AD&D first edition and second edition rules. And that was actually written by 3 separate authors who were all working on the 3 books of this trilogy. 2 authors worked on book 1 and 2, and then a 3rd author did the 3rd. And that was all over the course of like 6 months. It was just an insane time frame to get the trilogy out in.
So reading down, like literally just arbitrarily down the line, you of course, as we take a look at your grades here, obviously some people may have been better with the time, some people may not have, and some people were hitting up on themes a little bit better and all that. And I would like to think that over the course of time everyone gets better, but as we can obviously know, that's not how that goes. Obviously, some people do not reflect on their past mistakes. Some people do not reflect on other people's workings and teachings and all that. And you've openly stated that you are not reading one book in particular. Does that mean that at some point down the line you might think to yourself, you know what, there just might be an author I might avoid, there might be a series I might avoid, there might be a setting and theme I might avoid?
Uh, Possibly, yeah. I haven't gotten to the point of outright skipping an author's works yet. That's that seems a bit extreme, because I think that if I can read someone's work and have something interesting to say about it, the review is the fun part for me, not the actual reading. Like getting the chance to sit down and collect my thoughts and write something that I hope other people will find interesting. I can do that about a good book or a bad book. Honestly, the hardest ones to write reviews for are those in the like C plus, B minus sort of range, where it was okay. And it sometimes I have to struggle to find enough interesting things to say to fill a review, because the book was just neither good nor bad, but just neutral. So I'm okay with some authors being bad.
As long as it's not beyond a reasonable bad.
Yeah. If someone, I've never had an author who was so bad that I couldn't find something to say about them. And the worse they are, the easier it is to find things to say.
True.
Yeah.
But once again, you don't want to fall into the trope of bashing just for bashing's sake, because that's boring.
Yeah. There's no point in being mean-spirited about it. It's more about trying to unpack why something failed. And there are certain settings I enjoy more than others. For instance, I started with the Forgotten Realms ones because it was the one that I had the most nostalgic attachment to growing up. But I do plan to, once I hit around 1997 on the Forgotten Realms novels, which is about the point where TSR basically financially imploded and got acquired by Wizards of the Coast. I'll wrap around to other settings, Dragonlance, Spelljammer, Dark Sun, whatnot.
Do you, right now you're just hammering out Forgotten Realms. Do you have a different plan for the future? Are you going to go ahead and just do the same thing with Dragonlance, nothing but Dragonlance, Spelljammer, nothing but Spelljammer, or do you plan on having a little rotating circuit of some kind?
I think I might start mixing it up.
Okay.
at some point in the future, because I remember there being a lot of really bad Dragonlance books. I
Oh,
mean,
absolutely.
like, I remember that the average quality of those was really not great.
Absolutely.
Like everyone remembers with fond nostalgia the first six, and very few remember any of the ones after that, except like scattered bits and pieces.
Which is unfortunate, I think with that in particular, that is one of those things where you're trying to ride on the coattails of something, but you can't live up because there's only so much you can do with so little. There's only so much you can see with these individual characters, and only so much growth and development. You can only have so many battles that are 5 pages long. That's just like, oh.
Well, it was a very awkward position for TSR at the time because um, the details are fuzzy, but Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, the authors of the first two Dragonlance trilogies, had an acrimonious split with TSR, and uh, just didn't write any more Dragonlance material after that until much later.
Mm-hmm.
So TSR sort of scrambled to fill the gap with some short story collections by various authors and some random side stories about Weiss and Hickman's characters written by other people. But they didn't really seem to know what they were doing with the world after that point.
Which sucks because Dragonlance, I mean, you started off on Dragonlance, is what it sounds like. And, a lot of people did because, as we just mentioned, original D&D was just, oh yeah, we go into a room and we kill monsters and that's it. But a lot of people grew up in hearing the stories of Dragonlance about epic lands and epic tales and epic heroes, and that's what sucked people in. And then they started making their own adventures. So
Yeah.
Dragonlance obviously has this huge place in our hobby. And obviously, we just got word just a few weeks ago that the Hickmans they filed a lawsuit, but then it got dropped, and now we know for certain that there is going to be some novels coming out later on, which is pretty cool.
I think the problem, though, is that the very qualities which made the first couple of Dragonlance trilogies work, that they were big, epic, continent spanning, world changing events, made them exciting to read individual trilogies about, but made Kryn less useful as a shared setting. With the Forgotten Realms, it's more there's this huge world, and here's a story set in a little corner of it somewhere, and whatever happens there doesn't usually change the entire world. It's a story in this world. Whereas the Dragonlance stuff started off as here's this world, now let's wreck it with a huge war, and it was big and exciting, and then it ended, and it had a proper conclusion, and then where do you go from there?
You milk out 20 more novels, obviously.
They did their best, but it's an unenviable position for an author or somebody who's working on setting material.
Absolutely. I don't relish in any of that. I'm beginning the processes of writing now, and writing sucks. It's tough.
It is hard.
Especially if you get tagged with working off of someone else's stories. I couldn't imagine the amount of effort you have to go into that, and the things you have to say and do, and how do you work with someone else's creation. I don't think I could reasonably do it, whether that be because morally or because I just wouldn't be able to do a good job.
Well, I have to admit that that's something unexpected that's come out of this project for me, is reading and thinking and talking a lot about uh, all of these novels has really made me learn a lot more about the craft of writing. Like when you're looking at a lot of bad novels and thinking what would make this better, you start thinking about uh, what qualities of good novels really make them good. What what is missing in a bad novel that if it was there would have made it better. And you really get a new appreciation for writing that that you don't get if you're just purely consuming books for pleasure.
Absolutely. You are wearing different glasses when you are reviewing something or reading something, and sometimes those review glasses do take away some of what you want, but I think it's good to look at it from both perspectives. Of course, I think it's good to consume the media that you love and enjoy it, and then also look at it objectively and reconcile how you see these in different lights. So you are working on the TSR, novels right now, and you're going this and going that. You sound like you're going at a pretty decent pace, and there's no sign of stopping right this second.
Mm-hmm.
You are you're doing Forgotten Realms, then you plan on doing some Dragonlance, Spelljammer, Planescape. God, how many other settings are there? There's Dark Sun, Ravenloft. What even else? I can't even remember off the top of my head.
Yeah,
There's a ton.
those were the major ones that had novels done for them. If there were any novels about some of the more obscure settings like Mystara or Birthright, I don't remember offhand.
Yeah, I can't remember either. But so you're going down this big old list of TSR. Does this project actually have an end goal? Do you think? Do you end at TSR, or do you expand upon that and take it other places? Do you think?
You know, that's an interesting question that I just haven't thought that much about because the end, if it happens, is so far in the future that uh, who knows? I mean, I'm 56 novels in after 3 years, and we know that there's, probably 300 to 400 books total. The odds of me getting hit by a bus before I finish are probably higher than the odds of me actually getting through all of them. So I haven't put a lot of thought into what comes next. I just figure I will do this until I run out of things to say, and then I'll find something else to do creatively.
Yeah, and I hope whatever it is you do, you put in as much effort and compassion as you do with this one, because it is a delight to read. You know, and the journey of 10,000 miles started off with a single footstep, right? And
Yep.
you are, in the proverbial sense, you've only just like taken the step out of the door, reading all through all of the D&D novels, But
Yep.
once again, no one is doing what you do, and I suspect not many people are going to follow in your footsteps in this regard, especially if they see, all the things that you're subjecting yourself to. Then
Yeah, not if they know what's good for them.
exactly. So I do hope that at some point maybe you start, doing other things and doing whatever it is that you do that makes it so successful and fun for everyone involved. So you are reading through all these novels, only 56 so far, only 56. And you're of course picking up on all these tropes and ideas and all these machinations and all that. Uh, do you have any idea of what you want to see next from D&D novels? Is there things that you want to see progressed further and seen more of? Obviously, not repeating the mistakes of the past.
I, hmm, that's a good question. I'd say one thing touches on a point that I mentioned earlier, that uh, canon becomes a straitjacket, and it would be nice to see more books that were independent stories that were less tied into previous, Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance or whatever canon, that just stand on their own as good stories, instead of trying to, do some sort of big shared universe sort of thing. Because when you have a big shared universe sort of thing, you are obliging people to uh, to keep up with it all in order to feel like they're part of the world. And I think there's a real underserved market, I suppose, in just telling a good story. And that also extends to not just previous setting and changes in the history of the setting. Good Lord, there's been so many. But maybe not trotting out the same characters over and over again. Just giving new authors the chance to do something unique in their own voice and see what they do with it. Create their own characters, build their own little corners of the worlds. So just make it fresh again, I suppose.
Absolutely. We could, have a fun, like one adventure here, one adventure there, or we could have our 57th Drizzt novel, right? And obviously, it looks like some people want, that 57th Drizzt book.
Well, again, it's the literary equivalent of a McDonald's hamburger.
Mm-hmm.
You know what you're going to get. It is a familiar taste. Yeah, but you don't get surprised.
What does surprise me though is talking about D&D and Wizard of the Coast. We of course have been getting all these massive modules that are big old epic campaigns, but
Mhm.
thankfully the newest book that just got announced, Candlekeep Mysteries, that isn't a huge, big old, amazing, world-shaking campaign. No, it's a series of fun little adventures written by different authors. And that tells me that if Wizards of the Coast is willing to, instead of doing the normal routine, do something new, maybe they'll do the same thing in regards to novels. Maybe they will go ahead and tag a whole bunch of different people to go ahead and write a whole bunch of different little stories instead of big old, 16 book, series, right? I like the idea of picking up a book and reading it from start to finish and having a fun little adventure in there and not having to think to myself, okay, this is a setup for the actual thing. I think Wizards of the Coast certainly can learn from this experience, and I sincerely hope it goes well.
Me too.
Oh man, look at that. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what comes out of Wizards of the Coast now, especially if they get bought out by whoever because Hasbro doesn't like them. But I sincerely hope that they start doing well in regards to their novels, and I'm a huge DM, so I hope all the modules are going to be fantastic, and I certainly hope that people like you can go ahead and shed some light on the past, and hopefully that propels to something great in the future.
Well, hopefully it will be a series of signposts of what not to do in the future.
I mean, that's the thing, right? Is like, if you have three roads to go down and hey, don't take a left, that already makes it so you're at least going in some other direction. It could be equally as bad, but at least you know what to avoid. And that's kind of the point. We are learning slowly over time as human beings what to say and what to do, and more importantly, what not to say and what not to do. And hopefully that'll lead to a better and brighter future to come. I think that is going to do it here for this one. Thank you so much for talking to me because, I think the novels are absolutely fantastic, or at least they're fantastic to talk about and fantastic to look back upon. So go ahead and sell yourself.
Sure. So my site is called Let's Read TSR.com. And yeah, it's a review site for all of these interesting novels.
Interesting is the key term here.
And I like to think that reading the reviews is a fun and interesting experience. Sometimes more fun and interesting than the novels themselves.
Which is good because sometimes you want a Cliff Notes version than spending some time out of your life to read the whole thing, right?
sometimes you find good things. There are some authors who have been reliably good and that I've been pleasantly surprised by rereading the works of these, 20 odd years later.
Absolutely. It is great to, well, as I mentioned right in the beginning, it is great to go back to something that you did when you were much younger and be like, oh, thank God it wasn't nearly as bad as it actually was. That's always fantastic. Alrighty, that's gonna do it for us. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. That was an absolute blast. I can't wait to see more reviews out of Let's Read TSR, and I can't wait to see what the future holds for our favorite hobby that we love so much. That's gonna do it for me. Thank you so much for listening, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.
Thank you.